So as once again, the primary function of a film score is to serve the narrative. And that's why when you are doing the film scoring, you're going to be working a lot with the film director and reading through the script, trying to understand what is the emotional content of the narrative and how can you help be the storyteller as well as the screenwriter, or the if you've adopted a novel or a film that it will have different kind of original kind of text in that, you might be working with the person who originated the text or the screenwriter who's adapting that story, because you're, as a sound designer working on the film score, you're as much a part of the storytelling as anyone else is in that, I think. So film music is almost invariably designed to accompany what is seen on the screen. And usually you're not trying to create music that is to be heard separate from what is visually occurring on the screen. So that's something to remember, that composing for a film is very different than composing for a concert setting or for some other setting in which the listener may be only focused on the music itself. Remember, you are focusing on music but also part of a visual scene. So for film music, here are the usual functions. It will function, number one, as an emotional signifier. We've talked about where you can create an emotional sense of what's happening on the characters that may not be evident in the text of the characters. So in some ways, this is the invisible part of the emotions. So with the music, we can make a much more complex emotional palette to what the characters may or may not be feeling by how the music guides us to a particular kind of emotional sensation. So in some ways, the emotional complexity of a film is determined by both what the characters and the actors do in their technique, but also, much more importantly, I think, by the film score. This will project a lot more to the emotion than the characters can do just with the text. The second part we mentioned is continuity, where we will have these discontinuous film scenes that will be connected through that. A third might be called narrative cueing. And this is where we mentioned before, the giving more advanced knowledge, where we can start to cue either references to the past that may have occurred in these characters, or cue information about what might be happening in the future in the narrative. So this kind of narrative cueing is a very important, interesting part, I think, of writing film music. And then producing a kind of a unity. Those are the four main things we mentioned. So the next category besides the film score, and this is probably the largest category of what people do with sound design, is referred to as sound effects. And this is usually abbreviated by the letters FX, which sounds like sound effects in some ways. So we've talked about sound processing before, the way we can take sound audio files and process them in different effects. This is a slightly different term, because this refers to a category of sounds, not a technique necessarily like sound processing referred to. So sound effects are artificially created sounds or sound processes used to emphasize the artistic or other content in the films. So in motion picture and television, a sound effect is a sound recorded and presented to make a specific storytelling or creative point without the use of dialogue or music. So dialogue, music, and sound effects are treated as separate elements. So when we talked about earlier that the dialogue is the recorded text of the characters, and then if there is music, that we would have a sound composer or a film composer who will add music to that for all those ideas we just mentioned. But the sound effects are everything else that are happening in the score. So that's perhaps the largest category of things that have to be put into a sound are the sound effects, and that's the biggest probably number of people employed on a film in sound design are going to be the sound effects editors and producers. So when we talk about sound effects, we're never referring to dialogue or music, film score. We're only talking about everything other than the dialogue in the film. And then when I talk about reverberation or compression or flanging, those are sound effects, but they're sound processing effects. So I want to make sure we distinguish, we don't confuse these terms, because sometimes when you say sound effects, you may think, oh, that's just reverb. Well, that's not exactly reverb. That's all the sounds that are not dialogue and music in film. You may also hear the term Foley. Foley is, the definition is the reproduction of everyday sound effects which are added usually in post-production to enhance the quality of audio for films. Foley is more of a technique for creating sound effects than a type of sound effect. So often you will have a Foley artist is someone who, and you can do your own Foley artist, where you get different kind of physical devices and you record those sounds to match the specific kind of scene sound effects that are needed. Many times you will have a sound effects library where you can find things that will match in general to those. but often you will need a specific kind of quality. If someone is hitting a hammer on a particular metal plate, you may need to find that specific kind of thickness of metal plate. You may find other kind of sound effects in a library, which would be a hammer hitting metal, but it may not match the exact kind of material that you have in this particular scene. So the Foley is a type of subcategory of sound effects which often is recorded originally for that film. And often you will have specialists who are Foley artists or Foley sound editors who specialize in this world. So here are the sort of 4 categories of different kinds of sound effects that we'll be dealing with in sound effects. One might be referred to as the hard sound effects. And these are things such as door slams, any kind of weapon firing or cars driving. These are the obvious kind of large, hard sound effects that we need. And most of the time, these can be found with a sound effects library if they're not recorded in the original filming. The other category would be background sounds, which are often abbreviated BG. These are sounds that do not explicitly synchronize with the picture in many cases there, but they're just background over an entire scene. And they give a kind of a setting to the audience. This can be forest sounds or wind sounds or industrial sounds, depending on the setting that we're in. But these are important for delineating what kind of environment the characters and the actors are working in. So even if you're in a room, we may have to bring in the slight buzzing of incandescent lights or something that would give us exactly the kind of room we're in. There's a lot of subtle background effects that are important for defining the context of the scenes and where the speakers are working in. If the background sounds are part of the ambiance, which is part of the environment, these are referred to as Atmos for abbreviation, which is abbreviation for atmosphere. The third category are the Foley sound effects, which I mentioned, which would be footsteps, anything that would have to be recorded sort of standard on that particular film. And then the final one are more specific kind of, these are original design sound effects, which aren't ones that you would record in nature or find other ways. And what we've learned about sound synthesis usually is the technique. If you're doing, for example, some kind of science fiction movie and you need to have sound effects which are kind of not part of a natural phenomenon that we would hear on the Earth. So a lot of times you have to go to your synthesis techniques using what we've learned so far in analog synthesis, so with FM synthesis and so forth, and you can design original made sounds. So that's often a category where you have to make your own sounds that are not part of any kind of sound library that you can find already. So a few terms I want to talk about when we're applying sound into film. Usually you will find these terms being used. There's something called voiceover, or there's what's called synchronous sound, there's direct sound, and there's post-synchronization. So voiceover. When a voice of a character in the film is heard while we see an image of a space or time in which that character is not actually speaking, then we call this voiceover. So for example, we have the protagonist, maybe the character, we see the character walking as a child, and that person, the character is talking in a narration style. So it's the voice of that character that is on stage, but yet it's not in the right time for what we're seeing on the stage. It's a kind of a flashback, it's a memory. We're hearing the voice of the person talking about, but we're seeing them when they were much younger and what was happening to them. So that is where we have a voiceover. We're not going to be filming that in that setting. So here again, this is a type of narration which is coming from the character in the film, so this is still part of the diegesis category of sounds. The voiceover is often used to give a sense of a character's subjectivity or to narrate an event told in flashback. You often find this technique used in many genres, but specifically in the film noir. If you ever watch a lot of these sort of traditional darker films which have this kind of, where the character may have a different kind of dark past, or we're often talking about something that is nostalgic in the past, in which the film noir tends to kind of be a filming technique which focuses on what happened to the characters in the past and then what was going to happen to them in the future. So because of that sort of autobiographical nature of these films, you do find voiceover used extensively in those genres. But it's something that you will find in literary adaptations, often use this anytime there's characters which we need to understand more about their past, and sometimes a difficult past seems to be the commonality of voiceovers. The next category, synchronous sound. This is sound that is matched temporarily with the movements occurring in the images, such as dialogue corresponding to lip movements. Most Hollywood films today synchronize sound and images at the time of shooting. A lot of other national cinemas do it much later, which they will add those synchronizations to the sound after the original film has been recorded. Direct sound. When using direct sound, the music, the noise in the film, the speech of the event at the moment of filming is recorded in the film. So this is the majority of what's happening, where you need to have a lot of information about what kind of sounds that you can get a direct recording. Obviously the kind of microphones you use in this, whether you have a shotgun microphone to get up very close on that character so that you make sure you don't have other kind of extraneous sounds that may get into that if you're doing direct sound recording. So often the direct sound recording is done on a sound stage, where you can acoustically control other kinds of sounds that might be getting into that. And you have a series of microphones that are capturing the sound and making sure that all the dialogue and all the effects of what's happening on stage are recorded and at a high level. So the direct sound is a more common one, but it does take a lot more recording acoustical information to get the sounds captured cleanly. Usually, and there'll be multiple microphones used in direct sound recording almost always. And as I mentioned before, some national cinemas historically, such as the Italian, Indian, and Japanese cinemas, preferred to not record sound directly and to put all of that information and dub it in after the shooting was done. More and more today, most of the international cinemas are moving more toward direct sound, but it was easier for some of these Italian, Indian, and Japanese to dub all the sound in later, and so they would have more control over that than to try to record it live. So when we talk about post-synchronization, that is the process of adding sound to the images after they've been shot and assembled. This can include the dubbing of voices as well as inserting any diegetic music or sound effects. And post-synchronization is the opposite, obviously, of direct sound recording, where everything is put in afterwards. So when we're talking about creating the sound design for a film, what is the things we need? What is the process for how do we start this, and what do we need to do first? So obviously the first thing you're going to be doing when you're considering working with a film or a TV show or any kind of media is, if there is a narrative, you need to start reading the script. Obviously reading the script is the first step of trying to figure out what we have to do into the story. So when you're reading the script, often what sound designers will do is they will look for 5 different categories of ideas that they're marking in the script as they read through it. The first would be to identify any objects that are in the script. So if you identify an object, you have to make sure that that object is not, there's no sound emanating from that object. So make a sort of circle of what objects and what kind of sounds may need to be associated with those objects as you go through. The next would be actions. So you have actions that may make sounds that are not coming from the object, but may be coming from the characters, whether those actions are emanating from the physical voice of the character, or whether there's something that the character touches, or clothes that may be moving, or ruffling of sound, or any other actions that emanate in sounds. Obviously, the environment is the third category of sounds we have to sort of label. What kind of environmental sounds need to specify the location of the actor. And then obviously, as you're going through reading the narrative, you need to be trying to identify what is the emotional content of that particular scene or of each character on stage. Because in many cases, the film director will be asking you as a sound writer to try to help amplify or intensify or clarify the emotional range of a scene. If there are a particular kind of fear that needs to be evoked by the characters, many of the film techniques of close-up cameras will sort of highlight the fact that there's a fear element being developed by the sense that you can't see what's happening around the characters. So in certain kind of films, in horror films, you can always see that there's always a close-up on the characters where you as a viewer aren't aware of what's going around them, which gives you a feeling that anything could be happening to that character. So the film music also has, and the sound effects will be amplifying that same sort of fear motive. So identifying the emotions of a score is a very important part of what you're going to be labeling. And then finally, understanding where transitions are. Are the transitions dramatic transitions, meaning there's a shift in the dramatic element going on stage, or sometimes they're just purely physical transitions. If you are leaving one scene that is outside and then suddenly the next scene is occurring inside, how do you bridge that gap with either the environmental sound transitioning, or does there need to be music to cover over that transition? So here again, those 5 different elements you would mark as you go through and read the score. And it's very important that you start to label all the different kind of qualities of sound that you may have to be putting into a score. The next thing I think that always works, and I do this for even my own composing, is start to draw visual maps. And the visual maps can be done under different kind of structures. You will have a timeline, which usually horizontal is your time frame. But then what you do on the y-axis of each of your visual maps may have to do with different kind of polarities or different kind of extremes that you would see. Let's say you're looking at a scene and you're trying to understand where is there a difference between power and weakness in the characters. So where does this character exhibit the most power of the scene or throughout the story? And at some point you may say this character has a lot of power in their own identity. At some point they become vulnerable, they lose their power, and they're in danger of something happening to them, so that then there's a weakness to that character. So sometimes just trying to map out where that character's power and weakness will give you a sense for the kind of emotional things and the kind of qualities you want to amplify about what's happening to that character. So often you can do visual maps under different kind of polarities of whether there's life or death involved, whether there's any kind of polarity of extremes. You can sort of map out different kind of where the evolution of that occurs, and that helps you think through what kind of qualities need to be emphasizing what's happening at that moment in the scene. Obviously, that kind of visual mapping that you would do, you do several of those visual maps to an individual scene or to the entire story, is leading us toward this idea of developing a kind of a timeline, sort of spreadsheet of what happens in the story. So the final thing you're going to be developing, and perhaps the most important, is what's called the cue sheet. So a cue sheet is a spreadsheet time code where, and this is something where you would have on a film, they usually are put onto the film something called SMPTE time code. And this is a very specific kind of timing of every scene that is happening through the film. And then from that, you can identify each moment of time and then make a list of all the different kind of sounds and sound effects and dialogue and music and so forth that need to be occurring at each moment. So here's an example of a cue sheet that I've made, and you can see the different categories. This could be a much longer cue sheet, but on the left side I have the time going down for each scene, every second that's happening, and we could then align to what is the dialogue for that exact moment. And then I've got 3 different kind of sound effects that may be needed to be added during that moment of the scene. One of those would be a fully originally recorded kind of sounds for the scene, and then 2 different kind of ambient sounds needed to go behind those effects that I specify here. And then you can see on the final column wherever there's music needs to be brought into the scene. Those are the kind of things that your cue sheet will guide you through. So in the end, once you've worked with the film director and so forth, decided on the narrative, you've analyzed the scene all the way through, understood exactly all the different kind of categories of sounds you need to create, thought about whether these are part of the diegetic or the non-diegetic categories, then your cue sheet is going to be your roadmap for everything you have to then produce. And obviously, in a large production, this cue sheet would be different. There would be sometimes hundreds of people working on this in different specialties. But if you want to start experiment and find a film designer or someone, or even do your own video, and then try to just practice trying to create these different categories of sound effects, I think you can understand all the different techniques that you would need to learn in this. So the idea of doing sound for video, for film, for TV, for animations, for all the different kind of media qualities out there is a huge part of what people do with the digital sound design. So hopefully this can give you what I've gone through a little bit of introduction to the ideas and the concepts of things you'd have to think about in that. But pretty much all the techniques that we're talking about in this class should give you the basic facility to be a working editor, sound editor and producer of any of these different techniques.